The world is sleepwalking toward an economic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. While most people go about their daily lives, assuming the system will somehow hold together, the foundations of our global economy are cracking in ways that cannot be repaired. What's coming in late 2026 through 2027 is not just another recession or financial crisis, it's the convergence of multiple systemic failures that will make the Great Depression of 1929 and the 2008 financial crisis look like minor economic corrections. This is the story of how decades of financial mismanagement, technological disruption, and geopolitical instability are creating a perfect storm that will redefine the global economic landscape for generations. The crisis begins with debt, specifically the $38 trillion elephant in the room that nobody in power wants to acknowledge. The United States national debt has surpassed levels that any country in history has ever successfully managed. What's more terrifying than the raw number is the trajectory. The debt isn't just growing, it's accelerating at a pace that defies mathematics. The Congressional Budget Office's own projections show debt to GDP ratios reaching unprecedented levels within the next few years. But even these sober estimates fail to capture the full picture. They assume no major wars, no new pandemics, no banking crises, and no recession deeper than a mild downturn. Every one of these assumptions is likely wrong. The problem isn't just the amount of debt, but the cost of servicing it. When the Federal Reserve was forced to raise interest rates to combat inflation, they inadvertently created a debt trap of historic proportions. Think of the national debt like an adjustable rate mortgage on a colossal scale. Every time interest rates rise, the government's interest payments increase accordingly. We've now reached the point where the U.S. government spends more on interest payments than on national defense. Soon, interest payments will exceed all discretionary spending combined. This creates a vicious cycle. The government must borrow more money just to pay interest on existing debt, which requires more borrowing, which increases debt, which increases interest payments. It's a financial death spiral that no country in history has ever escaped without either defaulting or creating hyperinflation. But the debt crisis extends far beyond government balance sheets. Corporate debt has reached dangerous levels, particularly in the commercial real estate sector. During the era of near-zero interest rates, corporations piled on debt to fund expansion, stock buybacks, and acquisitions. Much of this debt must be refinanced in the 2025-2027 period, but now at significantly higher interest rates. The result will be a wave of corporate defaults unlike anything we've seen since the Great Depression. The commercial real estate market is particularly vulnerable. The shift to remote work has emptied office buildings across the country, destroying the value of properties that were purchased with massive loans. Banks are already seeing the warning signs, with commercial mortgage delinquency rates rising at an alarming pace. When these loans default, they'll threaten the stability of regional banks first, then larger institutions, potentially triggering a banking crisis that makes 2008 look contained. Meanwhile, the global geopolitical situation is creating additional pressure points that could accelerate the economic collapse. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, tensions between the US and China over Taiwan, and instability in the Middle East are more than just political problems. They're economic threats that could disrupt supply chains, trigger energy crises, and destroy international confidence at the worst possible moment. The weaponization of the US dollar through sanctions has prompted countries like China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia to develop alternative financial systems. While the dollar's dominance won't disappear overnight, the trend toward de-dollarization is real and accelerating. As countries settle more trade in local currencies, demand for dollars will decline, making it harder for the US to finance its deficits and potentially triggering a dollar crisis. At the same time, a demographic time bomb is ticking that will exacerbate the economic collapse. The baby boomer generation is reaching retirement age in massive numbers, placing unprecedented strain on Social Security and Medicare systems that were already headed toward insolvency. The response from central banks and governments will likely make the situation worse rather than better. The Federal Reserve and other central banks have already used most of their ammunition during the 2008 crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Interest rates can only be cut so far, and quantitative easing has diminishing returns while creating dangerous asset bubbles. When the next crisis hits, the traditional tools will be largely ineffective. Governments will likely resort to modern monetary theory, MMT, essentially printing money to fund massive spending programs. While this might provide short-term relief, it risks triggering hyperinflation that could destroy what remains of the middle class's purchasing power. What makes the 2026 crisis fundamentally different from previous economic collapses is the role of technology, specifically artificial intelligence. Previous economic recoveries were fueled by rehiring workers once demand returned. But AI-driven automation is eliminating jobs permanently across multiple sectors simultaneously. White-collar jobs in legal services, accounting, and middle management are being automated by sophisticated AI systems. Blue-collar jobs in transportation, manufacturing, and logistics are being eliminated by robotics and automation. Even creative fields are feeling the impact. The result is that when the 2026 recession hits, many of the jobs lost will never come back. This creates a structural unemployment problem that traditional stimulus measures cannot solve. The social and political consequences of this economic collapse will be severe. The 2008 financial crisis gave rise to the Tea Party on the right and Occupy Wall Street on the left. The 2026 crisis will make that political polarization look tame by comparison. When people lose their life savings, their jobs, and their hope for the future, they become desperate for solutions, and desperate people turn to extreme political movements. The center may not hold in many Western democracies, with populist movements of both the left and right gaining power and implementing policies that could further destabilize the global order. The housing market will become both a cause and a victim of the crisis. The dramatic rise in mortgage rates has already made housing unaffordable for most Americans, causing sales to plummet. But prices have been slow to adjust downward because of a chronic shortage of housing supply. This disconnect cannot last forever. When the recession hits and unemployment rises, forced selling will begin, driving prices down rapidly. Homeowners who bought at the peak with minimal down payments will find themselves underwater, creating a wave of defaults that will dwarf the 2008 subprime crisis. The psychological impact of watching their primary source of wealth evaporate will cause consumers to sharply reduce spending, accelerating the economic downturn. The international dimension of the crisis cannot be overstated. Europe faces many of the same problems as the United States, with additional complications from energy dependence and the lack of a unified fiscal policy. Japan's massive government debt and aging population make it particularly vulnerable. China's property crisis and local government debt problems threaten to end its decades-long economic miracle. Emerging markets that borrowed heavily in US dollars will face catastrophic defaults as the dollar strengthens and their economies weaken. Unlike 2008, when emerging markets helped pull the global economy out of recession, this time they'll be part of the problem. The timing of the crisis, late 2026 through 2027, isn't arbitrary. It's when multiple economic cycles converge. The debt refinancing wave peaks in 2025-2026. The commercial real estate crisis will be fully apparent by then. The political cycle adds pressure, with the 2024 U.S. election creating uncertainty and the following administration likely facing the consequences of previous policy decisions. The business cycle suggests we're due for a recession by the mid-2020s. And the longer-term debt cycle, as identified by economic historian Ray Dalio, suggests we're approaching the end of a 100-year period of debt accumulation that typically concludes with a major restructuring. What should individuals do to prepare? First, understand that this isn't about predicting the exact day the stock market will crash, but about recognizing the building pressures that make a major crisis inevitable. Reduce debt, especially variable rate debt that could become unaffordable if your income drops. Maintain significant cash reserves outside the banking system. Diversify assets internationally and consider holding some assets in forms that aren't dependent on the financial system. Most importantly, develop skills and relationships that will be valuable in a post-crisis economy. The people who fare best in crises are those with practical skills, strong communities, and the psychological resilience to adapt to changed circumstances. The coming crisis will reveal the fundamental weaknesses that have been building in our economic system for decades. The obsession with short-term profits over long-term stability, the financialization of the economy at the expense of productive investment, the refusal to address structural problems until they become emergencies, all of these chickens are coming home to roost. The 2026 crash won't just be an economic event, it will be a watershed moment that forces a re-examination of our fundamental assumptions about capitalism, government, and the social contract itself. The question isn't whether we can prevent the crisis. At this point, that's likely impossible. The question is what we learn from it and what kind of system we build in its aftermath. History shows that economic catastrophes of this scale either lead to authoritarianism and conflict, or to renewal and reform. The choices we make in the coming years will determine which path we take. The storm is coming. The only uncertainty is how we weather it and what emerges on the other side.